Okay, let's start. We're about to have our welcome from Verna McGregor. So let me turn things over to Susan to introduce Verna. Thank you, Susan.
Verna. Verna is a very respected Algonquin elder and has come to the Group of 78 many times to welcome us. And she always has, she's got a particular interest in climate change herself, so she sometimes makes interesting interventions on that I had never heard before. But Verna has also very, like Adrian yesterday, is very generous with her time and talent, is a community builder within her community as an elder and a grandmother, but also between her community and all the rest of the multicultural communities in Ottawa. And I'm particularly grateful to Verna because I phoned her up and asked her about something, what could we do at the Unitarian Church for reconciliation, and she said, we'll have a sharing circle. So she came out to the church and we had a sharing circle, and she was the inspiration behind the garden, the Indigenous Garden and Employment Program for people who wanted to learn to grow their own food and were very short of food. And so we have that going still at the Unitarian Church, and this was the inspiration. So, Verna, please, come.
Oh, miigwech, Susan. Hello, everybody. Good morning. It's a beautiful morning because I drove down from Kittigawn-Zibi this morning, which is even more beautiful. I'd say kweka kina verna nindishnika sa Kittigawn-Zibi nindoja bawagosh nido demashitcho nimki panesi dojimnendo nido denesonje. I'm very honored to be here today. Since I've seen Susan, I've been quite busy. I do a lot of talks and I'm invited to a lot of meetings on the issue of climate change, impact assessment. I'm part of the group also with Natural Resources Canada, with the elders, and they call it the Circle of Elders Nukwewash. So I try and bring understanding to a native understanding, because there is a difference. I was even yesterday with this reconciliation with the School of Public Service, the Canada School of Public Service, and I tell them too as well, you know, like sometimes too as well, this reconciliation goes deeper. It's also, for us, it's our connection. What was done here is also even the erasing of our language. The language is tied also to the land because it's so expressive. It also communicates it with the language, the use and understanding even of the species here. So that's where I was coming from. So I said the reconciliation goes deeper to it wasn't only what was done to First Nations on contact here with this reconciliation, but we need also a broader scope, that what was done, what we humans have done to other nations, and it's not just human nations, it's the ones that fly, the bird nations, the insect nations, the ones that crawl, the ones that swim, and the four-legged. And I said, because they are nations too. And what I was talking about too, on Monday and Tuesday, I had a meeting in our community, and it was on the American eel. And I was talking about also For us, as Algonquin, we're known as the Mamaninewug, the Algonquin of the northeast of Turtle Island. For those of you who don't know, Turtle Island is considered North America, because if you look at it from a higher view, it's shaped like a turtle. And there's teachings to that for us from the turtle. And it was tied to governance too as well. And this whole nation to nation before contact. So with this, we were one of the first to also meet the explorers. And here, the most notable was this Samuel de Champlain, who landed at Tadoussac in 1604. And they were starving, they were hungry because they were on a route, trying to look for a new route to the Indies for trade. So we brought them food and medicine. So we were their allies and soon became a nuisance, really, because when they saw, they were astounded by the amount of resources here, and that started with the cod fishery. Apparently, you just lifted up a bucket in the water. It's John Cabot, what their story is the same with the Mi'kmaq, and you would feed. They were in such an abundance. And by 1604, by 1610, they were calculating for the crown in France that they could bring 1 million lira just for cod itself. And again, but you look at today, that evolved. Look at the shape of the cod industry. With the and our basic understanding is you try to take only what you need, but the system also of this. It's capitalism. It's not that I want to be anti-capitalist or anything. It just sometimes it goes over abundance, over harvesting of the species. And what happened here with the American eel is it wasn't only just the cod. Then they started with also too as well the forestry. North America and the northeast of North America saw the largest extraction of timber in the world. And you look at it here, I wonder too, even just driving this morning, I said, I wonder what it looked like with the old growth trees that were still here, because now there's only 5%, if that, of old growth. And old growth is, I think, longer than 200 years. So, so again, here we are, but the other part is also, we still have our wampum belts, and one of them, because part of this colonization was a confiscation of our sacred items too. But Elder William still had, he was the carrier, and now they're sort of in not hiding, but in retreat. But one of them is the Seven Fire Prophecy Belt, which is the purple and the white belts. They're made out of quahog and welk, and there's a whole story to that. But one of them is the Seven Fire Prophecy Belt. And it foretold the newcomers come into the lands here to Turtle Island. And what happened is also too as well, that was foretold that we will come to a crossroads, that regardless of our differences, we will have to come together, put our minds together, because I think the world, we're at a crossroads even with the earth. And here we are, and William in the 70s and 80s, tried to lobby for that, to awaken the people. But here we are now, everybody knows that we're in climate change. So here we are. Going back to the eels, this evolution with the forestry, also with the lumber barons here in Ottawa too, this resulted in the creation of the hydro dams. And the Ottawa River watershed has 52 dams. And what happens is also too as well, with the turbines, the fish get cut up, especially the American eel. And that's what we were talking about at this past Monday and Tuesday. And we had Mi'kmaq elders too, because this past December, even now, there's a big black market for the elvers. The elvers are the baby eels. And the black market, they had to shut down that fishery with the eels because the black market is for in Asia, there's such a demand for them. So that's why we were sharing information. But the good hope comes now is we had another person from the Canadian Wildlife, and he gave a good overview, but we had these two young people from California, and they have their company, and just a sec. I just gotta, ow, I'm just trying to close this. I didn't. So what they did is, really quickly, I don't want to ramble on here, but what they did was they created now a turbine that is fish friendly. Yeah, and that gave me really hope. I said, oh, look at Ishkinaweg, the young ones. I said, it's like an awakening, because when they upgraded the Chaudière Dam here, they came to the community in 2016, and I mentioned, I said, would you, I'm not an expert, I said, but is there something like maybe a fish elevator, or because it wiped out 97% of the species. And again, too, it was a main food source for us, traditionally, still with the Mi'kmaq, and but also, though, too, as well, I said, well, what other species was this a main source? And you cut that out. Now we're in the age of species extinction. So again, can we bring that back? And that's why I said there is hope. And the hope is also, I said that with the young people, but even one of my projects in my community when I went back was also this maple syrup, but our tagline was blending tradition with technology. So it's important that we come together. And so here we are. And so really quickly, because I know you have the other part is also too as well, this past August, I was part of the community asked me to be the spokesperson for the near surface nuclear waste storage up here at Chalk River. And our biggest concern, first of all, I'd like to welcome you to our traditional unceded lands. What does unceded mean is that we never signed treaty with the lands here. And that goes back to the Royal Proclamation of 1867 with King George, that development will only happen through treaty. So I said, what happens when there's no treaty? And what if we don't want a treaty? And and why we brought this up is because our biggest concern with this near-surface nuclear waste disposal, they call it the NSDF, is that it's less than a kilometer away from the Ottawa River. And it doesn't, they said, oh, we have the water treatment plant, but it doesn't filter out tritium. And that still goes into the water. And this past February, even, there was a release of contaminants, but they wouldn't disclose what contaminants are in the water. And our biggest concern was also, it's not, we're away from the Ottawa River, but a lot of our community members live here and work here. I said, but also it's downstream from Ottawa, the nation's capital. And I was thinking about your community garden, and because I said that too as well. One of the things in the presentation, I said, they're talking about deglobalization, that we may have to go back to our local food sources. And I said, what happens now that when the land and the water is contaminated? And again, so that's where this uprising in process is. And again, going back with the Algonquin, we're known for the birch bark canoe because the rivers were our highways. And if you look, I should have brought my pictures too, but the rivers and streams were our highways. They are also considered the veins of Mother Earth, like our bodies. Women are keepers of the water because we bring in new life, and that starts with the breaking of the water. The men are the fire keepers, and it's like the sun shines on everything. but also, though, too, as well. So the significance of Ottawa here is you're at the confluence of the rivers coming together from the four directions. I came from the Gatineau River, which is the north, the river coming from the north. Then you have the Ottawa River, which flows from the west to the east, Kitchissippi, Tanagitnangsibi, and then up here you have the Rideau River, which is a funny river. It's a north-flowing river coming from the south, and we would meet here like we're doing today and talk about what's going on the land and what needs to maybe change. For us, we had our clan system, but with colonization, that sort of messed it up. That was part of the erasure. But also, though, too, as well, and that's why I say, my clan on my mother's side is fox, and the clan on my father's side is a thunderbird. And again, too, there's a whole system to that, even with the coming together, the partnering of the youth. So it's bringing back that knowledge, and that's why I'm honored to be here. And it's raising that awareness, too, that what's around the corner is that we need to look after the land. One of the biggest things with the medicine wheel, it represents the four colors of people, but it also represents the four seasons, the winter, spring, summer, fall. It represents the four directions, north, south, east, west. The sun comes up in the east, goes down in the west, cold in the north, warm in the south. It represents your journey here. You come from spirit, your ancestors. You take your first breath, like the sun coming up, and you do your earth walk here as you progress to an adult, older adult. Elders, as you, in preparation, return back to spirit. That's your journey, your circle. But the biggest teaching, too, is tied to we had our own creation story. We do have our own creation story that also, too, as well, there was four colors of people, and regardless of our differences, what binds us together is we share this earth. The water connects all of us because we're about 70 to 80% water. We share this earth. COVID taught us that, how we're connected by the air. And this the fire of warmth. The sun shines on everybody. That's you have Mother Earth and Father Sky, but the sun too as well. So that's where. But the biggest one of our teachings or stories is that, regardless of the colors of people, we were given the original instructions to be caretakers of this earth, and we haven't been doing a good job, I think. So that's why this meeting is important. So. Susan offered me a little tobacco, and that's part of protocol. This was used in ceremony, and that became one of the biggest commercial products too on contact. And it's considered one of the four medicines. And like any medicine, if you overconsume, it becomes harmful. So everybody with today, with the cigarettes and the smoking. So, but it wasn't meant for that. It was always in balance. And this also going back to balance, this represents a balance, your most emotional, physical, spiritual, and mental. I always find that interesting too as well, that with the four directions and with the rivers coming together, Parliament Hill is at that center. And so is all the federal government departments. So I said that's why I travel around and try and bring teachings. But this also, too, as well, this climate change is not new. I said that too, one of the things, too, we have stories from the Ice Age. And I was also with, Frank Speck used to come up here a lot in the 1930s. And he started the archaeological, not the archaeological department, at Penn State. But he also took a lot of our items. But we have stories from the Ice Age, but also with contact in 1492, always starts with Columbus. They estimated that there was about 112 million native people on Turtle Island, and by 1650, so within the span of over like 150 years, we were down to 6 million. So it's the biggest population decline in the world's history. And with that, it also contributed to a mini ice age. And now, because here we are as people, we have the Industrial Revolution. Now we're up to 8 billion on this planet. So I said, makes sense. I said, population goes down, planet cools down. Population now explodes. Now we're heating up. So again, I'm just going to say a little prayer for the work that you do and you're coming together. And I have my little eagle feather here. And so I say, miigwech. Onje ni gashki toche ma on dose konje non go mo me kakina pamad subject in as well konje shuen mishnon in abiges. Miigwech onje kakina gagishen don onje mom de gen in the kimenon. Shkaki question kason in the kimenon. We do kwa kakina pamad subject in as well konje. Onje oga nagdo abadan kakina gachin in the kimenon. Mom de gen nishno beki. Miigwech onje kakina ete kijagon kizis to be kizis a shijanang shak. We don't go on the Nokamis non on Jay Nagaruab non Kakina Gutshia, Nebi Punksing, CB, Saigon, Kichigagam. Migwach on Jay Ya Ishkude, Kagimi Jin, Chmino Objetoyang. We don't go Gia Kakina Mam de Gain Mishomson on Kizis on Jay Nagaruab non Kakina Gutch Pamaz, Jaka Shijinua on Jay Nagaruab on Kakina Gutshia Ishkude. Migwachonje na sewen ka gimijin chimino pamatzian. We do kwa kakina mam to get a shock as a jik mommy COVID-19 shish kakina go jokas win. We do kwa ninjin wen doganak ni mishomsin on the gokmisnon a shishin don't in his ocean onje the pashkadagmak the dabanoji shak a shish kam shedin as well gonje nongam. Kansheshkwat ni gwete simen kego gajemana dosich kana noj gachni gwete simen we do kwa kakina mam to get we snajik. Akas a jik, Demagus a jik, Kayewi mi gadu a jik, Chiwaniki wa je nabigis, Shwen mishnon, miigwech. Miigwech is thank you in Algonquin, c'est merci en Algonquin. I say this 4 times, to honor again the 4 directions, the 4 seasons, the 4 colors of people. And at the center too, as well as we're coming together here from the 4 directions, really the center, that we find balance in the discussions that we do today, and let's be innovative because innovation is needed. Miigwech. Oh, miigwech. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow, you packed a lot of lessons into that talk. Thank you.
She really packed a lot of lessons into those few minutes, didn't she? I think I could spend a whole day listening to that information. It's a wonderful way of starting our deliberations today. You're so correct, Verna. We are hoping to have innovation, some creative thoughts this afternoon. We've tried to bring together different aspects of the environment community and to talk about how to push the agenda more quickly and how to collaborate better to move forward. So thank you so much. It's excellent. Yeah. Roy.
Let me add my thanks to those of the words of Susan for Verna. And I think we're ready to go on to our next panel if we get the organizers to fire up. Okay. So I'd like to invite Sylvie to introduce the next panel and take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Bonjour tout le monde. J'ai ma présentation ici, donc juste le temps de s'installer. Okay. Welcome to this session on the lessons from the Nuclear Non Proliferation Treaty. And I know also the treaty for the prohibition of the nuclear weapons. I welcome our participant in presence. I welcome our participant online and those who will access this presentation after the Group of 78 annual conference will conclude. I'll welcome our guest speaker, Tariq Rauf from Geneva, and I send and share regrets from our second guest speaker, Cara Pike, who has not been able to reach us with the recording. She's been very involved with the climate conference in the last few weeks, so I will be your second speaker. So the new schedule this morning is that Tariq will be our first guest speaker for about 15-20 minutes. Then I will give you a quick summary of the fossil fuel NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and I will share some of lessons learned from the Mine Ban Treaty, which hopefully can reach between the nuclear situation and the fossil fuel situation. And I hope to have a Q&A of about 20 or 30 minutes, and this I will see Ruby giving me signs at some point in time. So on the board there, which is written very small, but that's still there for you to enjoy during the coffee break, and maybe we'll take a photo for those that are online. I kind of written a little bit like what is the world of treaties in the nuclear weapons, but I'll use this after, probably during the question period. But I just want to say that the Nuclear Weapon Non-Proliferation Treaty has been in place for 54 years. And right now, when we say the NPT, it's an umbrella. If I had been good at drawing, you would say big umbrella there. And 54 years ago, when it was put together, and here you have to always do the link with the fossil fuel where we're at right now. That's what we're hoping to bridge and gaps and have a very successful meeting with Richard and trying to see what civil society can do. So the NPT has this institution which basically brings in, some of the reporting and some of the safety, but it has not answered, very well on the aspect of the Article 4, which was disarmament. And there there was a new way and a new treaty called the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So my guest speaker online from Geneva is, in my opinion, our most knowledgeable Canadian expert in the field of nuclear weapons treaty, in the field of nuclear weapons disarmament, safety issue, technical knowledge, and missed opportunity. I welcome all our participants to view his biography as part of the Group 78 website, because I want to make sure that Tariq has as much time and space as possible to share this knowledge with you. We are very lucky to have him with us. So on this, please, Tariq, please start sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvie. And good morning to everyone in Ottawa. Can you hear me? So I'm very pleased
we
to...
can.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to thank the Group of 78, Troy Culpepper, Sylvie, and everyone else involved in organizing this very useful and timely meeting. It's a pity that I couldn't be there to be at this conference in person, having lived in Ottawa for many years before coming to Vienna. So I'm speaking to you from Vienna in Austria, which is the home of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that Sylvie mentioned in her introduction. So I was asked to talk about the experience of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as it might apply to a non-proliferation treaty for fossil fuels. So this quest for preventing the further spread of nuclear weapons starts all the way back from the beginning of the atomic age or the nuclear age in 1945. The nuclear bomb, as you know, was developed as part of the Manhattan Project at the Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico in the United States. But this was not a purely indigenous project, as is sometimes mentioned in history books. Most of the breakthroughs in atomic physics or nuclear physics were done over here in Europe by scientists from Hungary, from Italy, from Sweden, Switzerland, Germany, Denmark. who then fled Europe because of the advance of Nazism, and their talents were pooled together in the United States, which also provided the money. Canada also contributed to the development of nuclear weapons by providing some plutonium that was produced in Chalk River. However, on the 15th of November 1945, there was the renowned Three-Nation Declaration on Atomic Energy, which was signed by the Prime Ministers of Canada, the United Kingdom, and the President of the United States. And in this Three-Nation Declaration on Atomic Energy, it said that these are the three countries that have the knowledge, to use the term that they used, for developing nuclear weapons. And they are proposing that nuclear or atomic energy be used henceforth only for peaceful purposes and to prevent its further use or application for nuclear weapons. And the Canadian Prime Minister at the time, Mackenzie King, announced that Canada, although it was part of the Manhattan Project for developing the nuclear bomb, was the very first country to renounce nuclear weapons. So this is not sometimes appreciated that Canada was at the very beginning of the nuclear non-proliferation campaign. So while there was expertise in Canada, the nuclear material was produced for the bomb in Canada, some of it, but Canada became the first country to renounce nuclear weapons as part of the Three-Nation Declaration. And since then, under various governments, Canada has played an active role, although I am very disappointed and sorry to say that the current government and the previous Conservative government, in my view, have let Canada down, and its proud history of championing nuclear disarmament has been lost both by this current Liberal government and its preceding Conservative government. But then let me revert back to the start of the quest for preventing the further spread of atomic energy or nuclear technology for nuclear weapons. So there was also, following the Three-Nation Declaration of November 1945, there was the so-called Moscow Communique, where the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union established the United Nations Atomic Energy Commission. And the proposal here was that atomic energy technology would be controlled by the supranational United Nations Atomic Energy Commission, and it would then sort of license the use of nuclear technology and materials for peaceful purposes. But given the beginnings of the Cold War and the rivalry between the East and the West at the time, the United Nations Atomic Energy Commission really didn't survive for very long, and it was eventually dissolved in 1952. The very first resolution adopted by the United Nations General Assembly was in 1946. And in that first resolution of the UN General Assembly, there was a specific call for eliminating atomic weapons along with other weapons of mass destruction. So on the international diplomatic agenda and on the agenda of the United Nations, the elimination of nuclear weapons has been there from the very beginning. But unfortunately, given the competition of the Cold War and other competitions between the two major nuclear powers of the time, the Soviet Union and the United States, the early promises of eliminating nuclear weapons or controlling the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries really did not succeed and materialize. So there were some other proposals issued by the United States. One of them was known as the Atchison-Lilienthal Plan, and it called for the establishment of an international atomic development authority. And this atomic development authority would also be given the powers to punish countries that were misusing nuclear technology for military purposes. But again, given the competition of the Cold War, this plan really could not come to be implemented. And there were other attempts, the Baruch Plan from 1946 and also its competitor Gromyko Plan. So the US position at that time in 1946 was that if all other countries in the world renounce the development of nuclear weapons and accept some form of United Nations verification on their use of atomic energy exclusively for peaceful purposes, once such a system had been put in place, the United States would eliminate its nuclear weapons. The Soviet proposal was exactly the opposite, and they said, well, the United States should first eliminate its nuclear weapons, and then all of us other countries would also join the United States in renouncing nuclear weapons and not developing nuclear weapons. So again, these early attempts really didn't yield any successes. So in 1949, the Soviet Union became the second country to detonate a nuclear weapon. And then in 1952, the United Kingdom became the third country to do so. So at this time, the then President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, understood that nuclear technology could not be contained and that this technology would spread to other countries. And so he made this famous speech called the Atoms for Peace speech at the United Nations General Assembly on the 8th of December, 1953, where he proposed the establishment of an international atomic energy agency through which countries could access the peaceful applications of nuclear energy for purposes of electricity, human health, agriculture, and so on. And also this Atomic Energy Agency had the second mandate to prevent the military uses of atomic energy for nuclear weapons purposes. So the International Atomic Energy Agency was then established in 1957, and it was headquartered here in Vienna, in Austria, and it has been here ever since. In 1958, following the Treaty of Rome, the European Atomic Energy Community, or Euratom, was created, which regulated the use of nuclear energy within the European community. On paper, Euratom owns the nuclear materials and technology and leases them out to the members of the community for various uses, but this created in a sense, a contradiction, because both the United Kingdom and France, which detonated its first nuclear weapon in 1964, are sort of weapon states, and this sort of contradicts the Euratom arrangement, so to speak. So in parallel, Ireland and Sweden at the time, both of them were neutral countries. Ireland is still a neutral country. Unfortunately, earlier this year, Sweden renounced 200 years of unbroken neutrality and joined NATO, a nuclear-armed alliance. But the first resolutions in the General Assembly following from the 1946 first resolution, these two countries started to propose an international treaty under which countries would renounce nuclear weapons. So there were important resolutions adopted by the General Assembly in 1959 and in 1961, alternately sponsored by Ireland and by Sweden. In 1961, the Antarctic was demilitarized, and as part of the Antarctic Treaty, no weapons can be deployed or in the Antarctic, including nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction. And now, in October 1962, as you will recall, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Soviet Union brought medium-range missiles and deployed them in Cuba, and actually armed those missiles as well. And the world came very close to a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Fortunately, the crisis was diffused. The Soviet Union withdrew its nuclear-armed missiles from Cuba. In return, the United States withdrew its nuclear-armed missiles that were deployed in Turkey. But having had this close call, both President Kennedy of the United States and the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev then decided that one step would be to prohibit nuclear testing in the atmosphere. So in 1963, the Partial or Limited Test Ban Treaty was signed by the two countries. The United Kingdom joined them as well, whereby these countries undertook to carry out nuclear tests only underground. Until then, nuclear weapon tests were detonated on the surface of the Earth, underwater, on the surface of the water, underground, and even in space. So a lot of radiological contamination was distributed around the world, and including in Canada. The official position for many years was that the atmospheric nuclear tests that were carried out in Nevada and elsewhere in the United States, the transport of radioactive debris miraculously stopped at the Canadian border and didn't cross over. Although scientific evidence suggests that it actually did cross over the Canadian border, and some of those radioactive particles settled in both inhabited and uninhabited parts of the Canadian North. But the official position is that this transport of radioactive debris really did not cross the 49th parallel. So in 1965 was a very important resolution that was adopted. This put in place the framework for a future non-proliferation treaty. Also, following the Cuban Missile Crisis, the U.S. President then John Kennedy made this fateful statement that if we were not to have an international regime banning the further proliferation of nuclear weapons by the end of the decade of the 1960s, there could be 10 or 15 countries that could have nuclear weapons. So during the 60s, countries like Sweden, Italy, Hungary, and some other European countries had active programs doing research that could lead to the development of nuclear weapons. And they also had active nuclear programs whereby they had experience in using nuclear materials, and they also had a scientific cadre of engineers and scientists who knew how to handle nuclear materials. And of course, the information on designing a nuclear weapon was already widespread by this time. So this resolution, which is known as the UN General Assembly Resolution 28 of the 19th of November 1965, established five criteria for a future nuclear non-proliferation treaty. So the first criterion was that there should be no loopholes in the treaty which could allow a non-nuclear weapon state to go ahead and develop nuclear weapons, or for a nuclear weapon state to provide that technology to a non-nuclear weapon state to develop nuclear weapons. The second principle was that there should be an acceptable balance between the responsibilities and obligations of countries possessing nuclear weapons at the time and countries not possessing nuclear weapons. The third criterion was that such a treaty should be a tangible step towards the eventual elimination of nuclear weapons and nuclear disarmament. The fourth criterion was that there needs to be an acceptable mechanism for ensuring verification or effectiveness of the treaty. And the final fifth criterion was that countries in different regions that wanted to establish nuclear weapon-free zones in their particular region, that right would not be impacted. So despite the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States had this one common purpose: to prevent the emergence of more nuclear weapon states. So by 1967, when the negotiations were launched in Geneva at the then 18-nation disarmament committee, we already had 5 countries that had detonated nuclear weapons. China did it in 1964, and I correct myself, France did it in 1962. So these 5 countries are recognized under the Non-Proliferation Treaty as nuclear weapon states. And the criterion again that was used was a country that had manufactured and detonated a nuclear explosive device by the 1st of January, 1967. And now the record shows that the date of 1 January 1967 was deliberately used so that apparently during the 1967 Israeli-Arab War, Israel had activated 1 or more nuclear weapons so that Israel would not be counted as a nuclear weapon state. So the 1 January 67 is the line whereby recognition of countries as nuclear weapon states is drawn, so to speak. So 5 countries are recognized as nuclear weapon states, and the 4 other countries that have nuclear weapons today, North Korea, Israel, Pakistan, India, we refer to them as nuclear armed states, and we don't recognize them as nuclear weapon states. This is still playing with words, but it still has some important legal implications. So the Non-Proliferation Treaty opened for signature in July of 1968, and it entered into force in March of 1970. And since then, the treaty has become recognized as the cornerstone of the global nuclear arms control and disarmament regime. So this treaty is not a very long treaty. It's quite a short treaty compared to modern treaties. The first article of the Non-Proliferation Treaty is an obligation on the part of all countries that are parties to the NPT not to develop or not to disseminate nuclear weapons technology to any party or entity whatsoever. So the terminology is such that it includes both states and non-state actors. The second article is the obligation on the part of non-nuclear weapon states not to develop nuclear weapons or acquire nuclear weapons in any other form. The third article of the Non-Proliferation Treaty is the longest article, and it provides the mechanisms for the verification. And the verification of non-proliferation under the Non-Proliferation Treaty is assigned to the International Atomic Energy Agency here in Vienna. Article 4 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty recognizes what it calls the inalienable right of states to use nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. Article 5 calls for non-nuclear weapon states to benefit from peaceful nuclear explosions. In the 60s and 70s, peaceful nuclear explosions were regarded as a more efficient way of digging canals, blasting tunnels, creating new ports. So, but there is no difference between a nuclear bomb and a so-called peaceful nuclear explosive device. The technology is the same. But many countries still wanted to retain this option. However, in 1996, with the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, this option was closed. Now, Article 6 is the shortest article in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and this calls for negotiations in good faith to end the nuclear arms race and to have effective measures to achieve nuclear disarmament as well as general and complete disarmament. So this article has been a controversial article throughout the history of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The nuclear weapon states want to link nuclear disarmament to general and complete disarmament. General and complete disarmament is understood to include chemical weapons and all other types of weapons, including conventional weapons, whereas the non-nuclear weapon states have sought to say that these are two distinct obligations. Nuclear disarmament is one, and then general and complete disarmament is a secondary obligation. So it took us until 2000 in the final document of the 2000 NPT Review Conference to get the nuclear weapon states to accept the separation, and that's where we had the unequivocal commitment by the 5 nuclear weapon states to seek the elimination of nuclear weapons and nuclear disarmament, and general and complete disarmament was in a separate part of the document. Now, every 5 years since the entry into force of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, starting from 1975, there's a review conference to see how the treaty is being implemented and to try to agree on benchmarks or timelines for the next 5 years. So the first president of the review conference in 1975 was Inga Thorsen, a very strong Swedish diplomat. And this conference was heading for failure. And she said, since this is the first review conference of this important treaty, it cannot be allowed to fail. So she wrote up a final document, and then she used her diplomatic skills to get everyone to agree to that final document. The next review conference in 1980 failed to agree on a document because by then the Soviets were fighting in Afghanistan, and also we had the war between Iraq and Iran. In 1985, there was a patched up final document. In 1990, the United States could not agree on language on a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty, so we had no agreement. In 1995, the treaty had to be extended, so the treaty was extended indefinitely. Canada played a very important role in the indefinite extension of the treaty, but the indefinite extension of the treaty was conditional on certain promises made by the nuclear weapon states, which unfortunately they never lived up to or delivered on those promises. And then in 2000, for the first time, we had the most comprehensive final document, which, as I mentioned, included this unequivocal commitment to disarmament, also the 13 practical steps, and so on. 2005, the review conference failed over the establishment of a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. 2010, we agreed on 64 actions, but these 64 actions, in a sense, watered down some of the commitments that we had agreed in the 2000 document. Then in 2015, The conference again failed because of the differences over the Middle East. And in my view, Canada unnecessarily joined the United States and the United Kingdom in torpedoing any agreement. In my view, Canada could have remained silent and let the United States and the UK shoulder the blame, but for political reasons, Canada also was one of the three countries that prevented agreement. The next conference was postponed because of COVID, and we only had it in 2022. But then you had the Soviet invasion of Ukraine. And so again, we were not able to reach any agreement. And the two preparatory committee meetings for the 2026 11th Review Conference have also failed abysmally over differences on lack of nuclear disarmament, attacks on nuclear facilities, and so on. So today, the climate and environment on nuclear arms control has been probably even worse than during the Cold War. The UN Secretary General has warned about this very specifically in several of his speeches. For most nuclear arms controllers, the view is that we are closer to an accidental nuclear war today than we ever were after the Cuban Missile Crisis. The nuclear weapon states have backed away from pretty much all of their commitments. There's only one treaty left standing between Moscow and Washington. This treaty will expire on the 5th of February 2026, and then we will have an open-ended nuclear arms buildup. The U.S. Is concerned that China is building up to a higher level of nuclear weapons than before. The U.S. estimate is it has about 400, and it wants to build up to about 1,500 nuclear weapons over the next 10 years. 1,500 nuclear weapons is the limit under the New START Treaty for deployed or active duty nuclear weapons. As you know, we have about 12,000 nuclear weapons today, and most of them are in the arsenals of the United States and the Russian Federation. So now there is even no discourse. In the Geneva summit in June 2021, Presidents Biden and Putin agreed to start a dialogue, but then this dialogue was disrupted after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and now neither side is talking. And the three nuclear weapon states are busy building up nuclear weapons. So I will sort of conclude here, other than to say one bright spot was in 2017, 125 countries banded together, and they were successful in negotiating and having the General Assembly adopt the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is opposed by the nuclear weapon states and the 4 other nuclear armed states very vehemently. But also under the pressure of the nuclear weapon states, they have, in a sense, pressured those countries that have not signed to remain outside the treaty. So I will stop there, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tariq. But before we go to the question, I will use about 10 minutes here for doing 2 things. I found myself, when I started to learn about the nuclear treaty, that it's overwhelming, and thank God for experts like Tariq, to keep us informed and also educate our government, because as you can appreciate, global affairs have disarmament expert that moves, every 2-3 years to other positions. So Tariq has been key to continuing the education on this. So it could look quite overwhelming to hear the story, the effort, the institution, the treaties, the knowledge, the meetings over 55 years, and try to build a gap, build a bridge to the fossil fuel NPT, okay? So I'm going to attempt to do that for you, and I've built bridges before in my life, so hopefully I'll do a good job. So I'm going to use a theory, which usually we don't do in conference, but I'm going to do it anyway. So this is called a norm life cycle. It's a theory, and allow me to consider a treaty a norm just for today. My colleague Robin Collin is not here to argue with me, so I'm going to do it. So basically it's got 3 stages in a life cycle, and we do this for building too, which is another thing I do a lot. So norm life cycle, 3 steps. First steps is called a norm emergence. This is when we're brewing the idea we need a norm. Okay, we're brewing, we need this treaty, we need this treaty. First stage. Second stage is called a norm cascade. This is when we reach a tipping point and everybody agrees, yeah, we do need this. Cascade is the term. And a third step is the internalization. This is when everybody assigned to the norm. Like in the family, we do this with norms too. Like from now on, no drugs in the family. This is just another analogy, but just to say it's very easy. The internalization of a norm is that we sign, we ratify, we agree to bring this home, so we build up institution, we write some policies, we provide some funding, and we do things like monitoring and reporting, okay? So that's the 3-step of the life cycle. Now, you've heard Tariq talking to you about how the NPT as a norm emerged, and how it was signed and all the institutions that we put in place. And then we realized that we were having a problem because I made a mistake on my chart. Article 6, disarmament, there was not too much motivation to get it done. So they had to create another treaty, which is now there, and it's called the TPNW prohibition. We move, from stopping an expansion to prohibit, the use of nuclear weapons. So what we're doing today is trying to see how we can help the lesson learned from the nuclear weapon, how we can help some of the key points in the emergence so we can help the fossil fuel cascade so we end up with a treaty. Okay, so that's the first step of my thing. So think about it this way. Lots of lesson learned from the nuclear, the groups, the institution, the countries, etc. So it just happened that I studied the Mine Ban Treaty. This was supposed to be the end of my speech, but I'm just taking the liberty of extending, what I want to say. So the Mine Ban Treaty as great example to how it was from an emergence move into the cascade position. So here we go. It's another Canadian beautiful story where we had Lord Axworthy, in Ottawa, basically welcoming people, on what we should do, with the anti-personal mine ban treaty, etc. And to the surprise of even our American friends, said, you know what? I welcome you in 14 months in Ottawa, where we're going to sign a treaty. Now, it wasn't written at that time. 14 months later, okay, country came in and they signed the Mine Ban Treaty. And that's what I study, that cascade. So I just want to share some lesson learned. The first thing from my thing was that they needed to move the discussion out of the official UN discussion forum. The disarmament committee was just not helping the interpersonal mind. So what happened is that Lord Axworthy created the time and space. In 14 months, come back to Ottawa. And let's just chat here on the side. So first thing, they had to find a way of taking it out of the UN forums. Now, it created a bit of fuss, it's like, oh, you're getting out. But taking it out from the UN forum allowed for less secrecy. This is Sylvie's opinion. I have way more, but I'm just going very quickly here. Second point, there was this successful transnational and national civil society. Without it, no treaty. So this is where our power comes from. So in the case of the Mine Ban Treaty, it was the International Campaign to Bind the Linemans. They were the transnational civil society, and I have lots of organizations who joined them, etc. But key to that success was the Mine Action Committee in Canada, because what happened is that when Lord Axworthy sent the invite, well, I want to say challenge, but, when he sent the invite, the Mine Action Canada, just like, wow, they kind of ended up being kind of this key focus group that was pumping, like, what is an anti-personal mine? That nobody had really a definition for it. And most of the civil society had never seen one, so there was a lot of crisscross education like this. And I just want to mention, a lot of the groups, a lot of the NGOs that were women's rights, children's rights, land rights, poverty, they decided to join in the fight. They just said, you know what? We got to help this group. We got to help the civilians are losing life and limb. We got to roll it up. So it became kind of a big national NGOs fight. And I want to say the Red Cross. The Red Cross was, from my perspective, one of the key points because they hired someone, they did a study, and they changed the narrative. They changed the narrative from anti-personal mine is an essential weapon to, you know what, we don't really need it. And that became a big platform that was used everywhere in the world. Okay, so number 3, the essential political Canadian champion, okay? At some point, it's got to be endorsed by the politician. And we were lucky to have Lord Axworthy. And I spent some time, what triggered this man, to convince his leader that Canada was going to make that jump, knowing that the neighbor was not going to like it. So, 3rd point. 4th point, touch hearts, mind, and pockets of Canadian. So the loss of life and limb, of civilian harm by the anti-personal mine was real and present realities because it was happening every day. It's happening here and here and here. The fundraising was successful. The Canadians spoke to their official, okay? And I have other things I'll share this afternoon when we do the presentation for Richards, because here what we're trying to see is how can we take the lesson learned from the nuclear ban and take on the key points in the cascading of the mine ban treaty and how we can apply that for fossil fuel. But my favorite of all was the leadership and partnership between the elected official and the civil society. That made it that it cascaded in 14 months. And the mine ban treaty is some 22, 23 years now in. There's monitoring. There's, there's some cluster mines and some other, annoyance, but, let's just say that overall, my perspective is still a very successful thing. And when I attend World Social Forum and I go with my Canadian flag, this is seen as a beacon of light in civil society around the world, how it was achieved, throughout the world. The main challenge, there's always a challenge. I call it the invisible hand, okay? In the case of nuclear weapon and the anti-personal mines, the invisible hand is the military and the military-industrial complex, like all the people selling things and focusing everybody on weapons for victory, not dialogue for peace, which, is something I prefer. But in any case, the invisible hand is military industry, and it is power. And yesterday we heard our main speaker saying that fossil fuel is power, but it's two different power. One is military power for domination. And that's why I think the 55 years we've been working on a nuclear weapon can be reduced to much smaller because the fossil fuel is economic power. And we have most of the money. Yeah, our government takes our taxes, do subsidies. Maybe we can do something about this, but there's a power in the people here. So the invisible hand for the fossil fuel is different than the one for the weapons. So yes, they're very successful. They pay lobbyists to go to our government. We kind of think that there's money that helps, electoral campaigns and things like that. But I want to say that I'm very positive that it's easier to work with that invisible hand than it is to work with the military invisible hand. And that's where I want to stop my part of this presentation, that I'm hopeful for the fossil fuel NPT, and we have experts like Tariq that can dig into what has helped the nuclear weapon, because for all it says, at the beginning of the NPT, I believe we were 69,000 nuclear weapons had. Now we are at some 12, 13,000. So that has been successful. We don't have 50 years. That's what I'm hearing. We don't have 50 years, and we don't have the same challenges. So I'd like to open to Q&As here, and I know I have a microphone for Q&As, and there's maybe some question. Okay. Yeah, there is one for the people online, and I don't know. Okay. Okay. So for people online, please put your question in, that it be in the field that we've just covered here, the range of how we can cascade, the fossil fuel NPT. So no question online for now. I have one on the floor here. I love it because he's a former chair of the Canadian Network to Abolish the Nuclear Weapons. So Earl is our guest. First question. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sylvie. I have a number of disparate thoughts, and the first is that I always marvel at the depth and breadth of knowledge of Tariq Rauf.
Yeah.
And Sylvie mentioned that he was one of the most knowledgeable Canadians in nuclear disarmament, in the field of nuclear disarmament. I would go much further. He is actually one of the most knowledgeable people, to my mind, in the world, and one of the most effective nuclear disarmament activists in the world. So thank you, Tariq, for everything you do.
Yeah, thank you.
There's been reference to UN fora and the inability of certain UN fora to get things done. The fact that in certainly the Mine Ban Treaty, things were taken outside of the traditional fora. That has happened on a number of occasions, actually. And that, I think, can be at least in part chalked up to rules of procedure. And I think Tariq knows this better than anyone, that in the Conference on Disarmament and also in the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which is the UN fora to address conventional weapons issues. There is a rule of consensus that has been misinterpreted to mean unanimous agreement before anything can proceed. And this has held things up dramatically. Fortunately, because of people like Lloyd Axworthy when he was Canadian Foreign Minister, and others who had the courage and the boldness to go outside the system and bring together like-minded people and countries, that we've been able to circumnavigate that to some extent. Now, those two fora still exist. They are of some use, I think, especially CCW, that has managed to get some things done. The Conference on Disarmament hasn't accomplished anything of note, I think, for over 20 years, which is tragic. But I would very much like Tariq, if you don't mind, to comment on the dynamic, Tariq, between what happens within the UN fora and how they actually, in my view, contribute to a great extent to at least raising the level of dialogue and the level of concern that sometimes then pushes countries outside the system to get things done, and also on the dynamic between civil society and governments, because in my experience, as powerful as civil society is, as Sylvie said, nothing really happens until you get governments on board. And if I may just make one comment about that as well. When we talk about governments, we are not only talking about parliamentarians or legislators. We are talking about the public sector, public servants, and you should never underestimate the power of public servants to influence the decisions that parliamentarians, that legislators make. I have seen it firsthand, and it can make all the difference in the world. In the case of nuclear disarmament, we have people like Alexander Kement, Austrian ambassador for disarmament, who has been remarkably effective in influencing the position of his government. And I have seen that in Norway, in Canada at different times in our history, and all over the world. So, Tariq, if you'd be so kind to talk about the dynamic among the players and how collectively they can make things happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Earl, for your kind comments. I wanted to also thank Sylvie for making the connections that she did on how the Mine Ban Treaty was achieved. And one can say that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons also followed the same trajectory that you defined, Sylvie, including the cascading effect. So for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, you had these three conferences on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons in 2012, 13, and 14, and the International Committee of the Red Crescent and the Red Cross, and also international physicians produced these studies that showed how the development and testing of nuclear weapons over the past 70 years have affected communities in the South Pacific, in Kazakhstan, in Nevada, in Algeria, the indigenous people in Australia, where British nuclear weapons were tested. And then again, like Lloyd Axworthy, Earl already mentioned the name of Ambassador Alexander Clement, who's the director for disarmament here at the Foreign Ministry in Austria. He did this very successful conference in 2014 where 159 countries signed up a pledge to have this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And again, it was a combined effort of civil society through the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, which is an umbrella organization of more than 500 activist civil society actors around the world. So it was, as Earl pointed out, and as you pointed out, Sylvie, it's the multiplier effect of civil society supported by government. And there was a core group, which is Austria, Ireland, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, and Mexico, that championed the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Normally, we find that civil society puts up a demonstration outside some international forum asking countries to do something. In the case of the TPNW, the United States, the French, and the British ambassadors had a demonstration outside the UN General Assembly Hall, trying to stop countries going in the hall to adopt the TPNW. So it showed how much, excuse me, this treaty worried them. So the TPNW, just like the Mine Treaty, shows the power of civil society. But of course, as Earl mentioned, we need civil servants and governments to act on these particular measures. So we need the champion, as was mentioned. But unfortunately, now the pressure is too much, and the champions, the Austrias, the New Zealands, the Irelands, the South Africas, and the Norway are being cowed down by the nuclear weapon states because of the war in Ukraine. Now, Earl is absolutely right that we have become prisoners of procedure and rules in the UN Forum. So just over the weekend, we had this Summit of the Future, and we adopted, or they adopted, the Pact for the Future, and there's very little in it on disarmament, Actions 25 and 26, but there's very weak language in there. There is no recognition of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, no recognition of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and in some effects, this Pact for the Future, its elements and actions on nuclear disarmament are more regressive rather than progressive. The Conference on Disarmament is frozen in time. It was established in the first session special session on disarmament in 1978. And as Earl pointed out, we have this consensus rule, which prevents agreement, that unless everyone agrees, even one country can object to agreement on an outcome document, and then there is no outcome. So there are various proposals put forward to have consensus -1, consensus -2, but then all the countries are concerned that, well, today I may accept consensus -1 or consensus -2 or consensus -X because it is the other side that's denying consensus. But the day after tomorrow, it might be me that wants to deny consensus because people are pushing through a treaty that I don't like. And therefore, I don't want to be in this position for this instrument to be adopted under this consensus -X rule. So that is preventing a reform. And the Western countries have consistently opposed establishing the fourth special session on disarmament so that one can change the rules and procedures of the existing disarmament machinery, which is the Conference on Disarmament, the UN Disarmament Commission in New York, and the First Committee of the General Assembly, where resolutions are adopted. Given the current situation, given also the control over the debt situation by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the main contributors to that, many countries in the global south who would like to be more outspoken on disarmament are beaten down because of the economic pressures brought upon them, because of their indebtedness, because of them wanting access to trade and so on. So there are all these other linkages that are established that go beyond disarmament that are very much in play today in terms of global power politics, unfortunately.
Thank you, Tariq. Do we have any question on, okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions from the crowd here? Maybe we'll overwhelm you with some of, this huge file. Again, I feel that, the domination power is different than the economic power. I think that for Canadian, the climate change is closer in their present day, here in present day, than a potential drastic, nuclear, nuclear weapon detonation somewhere in the world. There's denial, for sure, on both files, because people want to keep with their train of life. I think it's going to be easier to reach Canadian with the fossil fuel than necessarily with the nuclear weapon. I want to say that we, the Group of 78, is part of the Canadian network to abolish the nuclear weapon. It's a Canadian network of 17 organizations, and I myself and Earl have been talking to various MPs, over the last, not this year, but the last 2 years, because we wanted Canada to observe the meetings of the TPNW, the prohibition meeting. Canada has not signed, ratified, we're not there. And we believe it's because of pressure by our neighbor, and the reason given is that we could be kicked out of the alliance of NATO, which I don't believe, because we are two-party on something called NORAD that the United States needs. So anyway, Earl and I had some meetings with all members, well, except for one group, right? But we met all the MPs, and they're very, very well informed on this file. It's amazing. They understand. But yeah, if Canada could be observer to the TPNW meeting, we feel that we would have gained, some presence. But like Tariq, I'm saddened by the lack of Canadian leadership, over a number of years, scanning two different parties, in my perspective, my glasses. And I believe that, as demonstrated by our guest speaker yesterday, that Canada has knowledge, expertise, courage, and still have a seat at the leadership in the world. So one more question. Gord, right here at the front. George.
Yes, thanks, Tariq, for your contributions and expertise. I'd just like you to speculate a little bit, given your vast knowledge of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and now the Treaty on Prohibition, what kind of and knowing the principles behind those treaties as well as the operational development of them, what would be what would be in your mind the kind of principles in the Treaty on Fossil Fuels that could be arrived at, given that the whole background is based on COP, on the work that has been done there, on global warming, on restricting the increase in temperature, given that that would be all the background of this treaty, then what would be the principles? Would it be something like a commitment to phase out fossil fuels in support of this over a period of time, and a certain kind of collaboration among states to make that possible in terms of, in terms of development economics, in terms of economic transfers? You probably couldn't get obviously a total prohibition on fossil fuels. You might get some sort of commitment over time to phase them out with appropriate types of collaboration and cooperation, drawing on the international community. But I'm wondering what in your mind might be the principles of this new treaty, drawing on these nuclear treaties.
Okay, you muted, Tariq. I don't know if it's from your hand or our end.
Yep, it's from my end. So thank you for that question. And I wanted to bring up one point that I didn't respond to from Earl, and then I'll answer this question on the principles. Earl also mentioned the role of civil servants. So the reason why Canada was successful in the Open Skies Treaty and the Mine Ban Treaty was that there was an activist foreign minister. So there was support top down. So foreign service officers like Earl and others had the support of the minister, so that when other countries would come and complain and put pressure, the minister would protect their officials and say this is national. This is exactly what Alexander Clement had here in Austria when France and the UK and the other EU countries came to talk to the federal chancellor and the foreign minister, saying, these are disruptive diplomats. They supported that diplomats. So it's essential to have this partnership between the political leadership of the country and the civil service, and of course, also civil society. Now, unfortunately, Global Affairs Canada, as far as I know, is not providing any substantial funds to any Canadian NGO working on nuclear disarmament. They are funding outside of Canada to some think tanks and the Nuclear Threat Initiative, but not to Canadian entities. On the other hand, the Defense Department, even though it has had budget cuts, has maintained its funding for strategic studies centers at the 10 universities across the provinces, which are supporting increased military expenditures and Canadian policy in NATO and so on. So coming to the question, I think one important issue is the issue of harm. The harm that is has been caused and is being caused by the burning of fossil fuels on the human health and also on the environment. And so that's one important principle, that for limiting and banning fossil fuels is to address the harms that have been caused and to reduce and mitigate and to end those harms if fossil fuels are phased out. And the term you used, phase out, is I think the practical one, because even if the OECD countries completely phase out fossil fuels, in many parts of the developing world, they will still continue to burn fossil fuels, unfortunately, for energy production. Those who support the phase out, in some cases, support small modular reactors, which are small nuclear reactors. That would create a problem of its own. There's also development of other alternatives. I was just hearing one of the, I think Finland or one of the Nordic countries, 58% of their energy last year came from renewables, and they were on the way of reducing completely dependence on fossil fuels. So this, I think, is more of an option for the richer countries, which can afford to invest in technologies and for their publics to pay a higher bill for their electricity coming from alternative sources, as opposed to many of the developing countries for whom subsidies would need to be formed. There are also the concepts of energy parks. So instead of countries having their own, those that are geographically contiguous, where it makes sense, for the distances may not be so great, to have energy parks for having a consolidated energy system, which again would rely on alternatives to fossil fuels. And then I think is to make investment in alternative fuels more attractive in terms of rates of return for investors to put their money in there. So as there is more funds available, that would make more funds available for further research and development, as we can see, for example, in the IT or computer industry with AI and others, where a lot of innovation in ChatGPT and artificial intelligence is coming as a result of the funding and the investment made in those particular sectors. So I think it would be a long process, but we need to have political leadership and then also strong public servants and civil society to push through this message and to start somewhere. And for this then to grow, just as the mine ban treaty was opposed by many countries that use mines, but then it also created a taboo. And so there was a lot of pressure on them that these are technologies or weapons that are not kosher, so to speak, and one doesn't want to be listed in those countries that are still relying on them. So I think the same could be a thing for fossil fuel, that countries that end up on the list of still burning fossil fuels feel moral pressure that they are engaged in a technology that is harmful to their own people as well as to the world at large. Thank you.
If I could add to this quickly, again, I remain more positive for the fossil fuel NPT. So what we're talking about is alternative to, right? So in the case of nuclear weapon right now, the alternative to nuclear weapon or nuclear weapon deterrence, is working really hard. We have, again, a lot of Canadian experts building on common security, this idea that we can be together and provide security by other means than nuclear weapons. So that's the alternative to nuclear weapon. What happened with the Mine Ban Treaty, which is a kind of an interesting fact, was that we did not have an alternative to the anti-personal mine when Mr. Axworthy said, meet you in 14 months. So what happened then very quickly is that, Global Affairs said, oh my God, like we've never seen a mine, so let's get, somebody from D&D come in. So a general came through, a military engineers, which I happen to know. So he came in and he was the one being deployed to various countries that wanted to continue the use of the mine ban, the anti-personal mine, because it was protecting their border. And within that 14-month period of time, the Canadian intellectuals, the knowledge, the academia, everybody got involved, and there was some new technology that came in with, kind of the equivalent of the invisible fence for your dog these days, but, I won't give you the rest of the details, but it was the equivalent of that was kind of created, and other countries signed the Mine Ban Treaty because they knew they could continue to protect their border without that particular without the mines. So again, sometimes, under pressure, with the funding, with access, with the support, then we can get some of our brain power and direct it to other things. So I remain positive for fossil fuel. So I think that's the end of it. So I have one more question. Is it going to be quick?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
I want to build on the harm issue, and Sylvie, I would have liked to hear at some point more about the political leadership and how you brought together a group of non-specialized agencies. You mentioned women, you mentioned children, you mentioned land. I think for this conference, when we're trying to confront through civil society, I think it's very important to get outside of the specialized environmental groups. So I think we can learn from that. The harm issue, I have never seen a flood, I've never seen a wildfire, but I am seeing them on TV, and I am realizing that they're getting closer to us. I have seen a tornado, so I'm beginning to see the reality of it. I like the idea of the Red Cross as an organization that is concerned with responding to floods, with responding to tornadoes. So I think you've really given us, you've expanded our way of thinking. I'd just like to talk about the Lloyd Axworthy. I was taken to hear Guibo the other night, and he may not be around for a long time as a minister, but there are things that he can do in the next 2 or 3 months, I hope, that could actually bring together that broad group that you brought together around the mine treaty. And I think we've got a proposition here that gives us new hope that we can actually do something to stop the apocalypse that Rolly talked about and Adrian talked about yesterday. So thank you for bringing that.
Yeah, and I just want to say that I encourage all of you and presence and online to participate throughout the day, because our last session with Richard is asking us the question, what can civil society do? And I do have more ideas for that, but certainly, we'll be able to continue to work on what you just said. So, Tariq, well, I don't know when I'll see you again, maybe in October, for our big meetings and conference on around the Canadian network to abolish the nuclear weapon. Thank you so much for today and the opportunity to share our knowledge. Thanks.